Well, thank you for coming in. My name is Priscilla Sloan, and today I am interviewing Alan Hayashi. And today is Thursday, November 7th, 2024. George is our videographer, George Lowry. And I'm going to start off with my first question is, when were you born, Alan?
I was born April of 1945, and I was born in a World War II Japanese internment camp, which was called Poston, Arizona, located in La Paz County, about 3.5 miles from the Colorado River on the Arizona side. So we'll stop with that. We can get into more details as we get in.
Yeah. Who was your father?
My father's name is Tadashi Hayashi, Tadashi. And he was born November of 1916 in Brawley, California, which is in Imperial County. It's the most southeastern county in California. And I'm glad that we moved from there.
And your mother's name?
My mother's name is Yaeko, Y-A-E-K-O, Hayashi, married name. Born in Stockton, California in December of 1922.
And Alan, did you know any of your grandparents?
I did.
Were you close with both sides, or did you know one side a little bit more?
I knew one side a little bit more, and I can get into that history a little bit, but it had to do with when my mother had tuberculosis and my grandparents took care of me. So the answer is I knew both sets of grandparents, but the maternal side more.
Okay. Let's start off with your maternal side. What were your grandpa's name?
My maternal grandfather's name was Yayetaro, Y-A-Y-E-T-A-R-O, Yamate, Y-A-M-A-T-E. My grandmother's was Oshie, O-S-H-I-E, Yamate. Both immigrated from Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan in the early 1900s. Probably for them it was right around 1916, somewhere in there.
Do you know when your grandpa was born?
My maternal grandfather was born in 1886. No, I take that back, 1888.
Okay. And your grandma, when was she born?
1896.
1896. All right, and let's ask about your paternal grandparents. What was your paternal grandfather's name?
His name was Masataro, M-A-S-A-T-A-R-O, Hayashi. And he was born, and they also were from Hiroshima Prefecture. Both sides of the family were from that particular prefecture, and there's probably a reason why. But he was born in 1896.
1896. Okay. And your paternal grandma's name, what was her name?
Yachio, Y-A-C-H-I-Y-O, Hayashi. Yeah.
And when was she born?
1898.
1898. And could you tell me more about your maternal grandparents taking care of you? How did that happen?
It happened because when my father and mother got married in March of 1944, and she was carrying me in the internment camps in Poston, Arizona, she was then had tuberculosis, largely because in the camps there was a high incidence of tuberculosis going on because of all sorts of reasons. So my grandfather said I wasn't actually supposed to survive because she was positive with tuberculosis. So what they did with her is, because there were not enough facilities in the internment camps to take care of the tuberculosis outbreaks, they allowed her to be placed in a private TB sanitarium in Phoenix, Arizona, called St. Luke's Hospital. Then a sanitarium, still exists as I understand it. When she was ready to deliver me, they allowed her to come back into the camps, deliver me, hand me over to my grandmother, and then they sent her back. So my grandmother then took care of me in the camps, then the other grandmother after we got out. So there was two issues with grandmothers. The grandfathers were working, doing whatever they needed to do. But it is somewhat of a sad story, because for the first almost 10 years of my life, I never saw her because she was hospitalized the whole time. So that's where the grandmothers came in, that took care of me and essentially almost raised me until I was 9.5 or 10.
And so your whole family was in the same camp?
No.
Okay. How did both the grandmas help take care of you then for the first 10 years?
Okay. When my mother's family was incarcerated from Stockton, they were first interned in a temporary assembly center in Merced County. Those were called assembly centers before the camps were actually built, so it took a few months. From Merced, my mother's family, the maternal side, then took a train up valley and right over Lake Tahoe, and they didn't know where they were going to end up, but most of the internment camps were close to railroads. They ended up in an internment camp called Amachi, and that is close to the town of Grenada, Colorado, on the Kansas border. It's right at the corner. That's where my mother's family was. In about 1943 or so, the government then started allowing some of the Japanese to go outside of the camps to farm on behalf of the government, to provide food for the camps, but also provide food for the war effort. My mother's family was then allowed to go outside of the camp during the day and work in the sugar beet fields close to Grenada, Colorado. Amachi is the term. My father's side was interned in Poston, but the same thing happened. They were allowed to go out. So he and his father had gone to parts of Texas, parts of New Mexico, and on their way back came through Grenada, Colorado, and he spotted my mom in the field, and he sort of got a liking for her. The story is they never dated. Comes back to Poston, Arizona, and he starts writing her love letters.
Oh, wow.
And her brother would go to the mailbox and say, "There's a letter for you, Yayako." And she agreed to marry my father, as she put it, anything to get out of these frozen sugar beet fields.
Wow.
I don't know this guy, but in those days there were arranged marriages as well. So she agreed to marry my father, who was in Poston. My father then sends his mother and his youngest sister to Colorado to escort her back. And then they got married in the camp. Okay. So my father's mother and father were in that camp until that ended. How the other grandparents took care of me is after we got out of the camp and ended up back in San Diego, and my mother's side, her mother took care of me. for almost 4 years because my mother was then put in another TB sanitarium called Vauclain in San Diego, Vauclain, which was originally built around the turn of the century in the early 1900s. They were called general hospitals. They were for the poor people who couldn't afford anything. They were called, but it became TB sanitarium. That's where my mother was, and that's when my grandmother took care of me because my dad was working as a gardener. He couldn't take care of me, so I lived with the other grandmother. So I'll end there because there's much more to the story.
And because you probably have less memories of your grandparents, I'm going to focus on them first before we move on to your parents. What do you most remember? What are your fondest memories of your paternal grandparents?
I think some of my fondest memories are actually being out in the farm with them. There was no such thing as childcare in those days, right? So like many families, you drug your kids along with you out there. So I remember fond memories of being out in the farms with them. They're all working, but I mean, that was sort of my playground, right? I remember being in the fields with the Mexican farm workers as well. This is after the war. I remember grandparents and grandfathers teaching some of the Japanese rituals. Now, what I'm trying to do here is because the Issei's, the first generation to come to this country, Issei, for number one, were, I think, emotionally more connected to Japan because they were eventually going to go back, but the internment stopped all of that. They were coming here, the grandfathers were coming here earning money 2 or 3 times. They're eventually going to go back, but then World War II changed all of that. They never went back, okay? So, but they hung on to the culture more, especially my father's side of the family and grandfather, because they were Buddhist and they knew and stuck with the cultural traditions much more. My mother's side of the family had converted to Christian faith in the 30s as a part of assimilating. Mm-hmm. So there was this dichotomy that was there, right? But back to your question, the grandfathers taught me this kind of ethic that said, don't complain, just shut up and just work. And part of it was the internment thing, is don't make yourself obvious here, just work, right? And that was almost an unspoken kind of a thing. Well, I'll stop there because you want to talk about, that's the grandfather part of it, Mm-hmm. Both of them were men of very few words, but the lessons have come to me in the last 5 or 6 years. The lessons are much bigger now than they were then. Wow. And I don't know why that is. I think part of it's my age. You start reflecting back. Mm-hmm. It's like your grandfather tells you, work hard. Okay, fine. Of course. Right. Okay. So.
Could you tell me more about your paternal grandmother and your memories with her?
Yeah, my dad's mother was very quiet, didn't speak a lot, but was the one, according to my father, who was the most educated and came from a part of Japan that's called the Sacred Part of Japan, Miyajima Bay by Hiroshima, beautiful area. And she was the one who did the Japanese flower arranging, and she was the one that came from the samurai family. And so in Japan, it's a caste system, right? So she came from a higher caste system, as I understand it, right? And she was the one that would tell my mother, when my mother joined the family in Poston, and I think my mother resented it because she would say, "You don't speak correctly, that's like ignorant. This is how you drink tea. You have to wait for your bath until the men go first." You know, like it as or not, that's what was happening in those days, right? The baths, the baths. And so I think my mother she didn't like it.
A little rebellious?
Yeah, because, but my father also, I think, he spoke the language better. He wrote the kanji. He was much more literate that way. And so I don't know whether that was part and parcel to being assimilated. It's probably why I don't speak Japanese, because after the war, I'm not speaking Japanese in public. There's no way. I grew up in San Diego. That's a Navy town. Navy, big time World War II. So it's probably why I don't speak Japanese. I wish I did. I think it's nice to be speaking, but that's what I remember of my father's mother. Pretty classy woman, though. Pretty classy, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, would you like to tell me more about your mother's side? You can start with your grandfather, or you can even just talk about both of them, whatever you feel like.
Yeah. One of the things I remember them telling me is I said, "Why are there so many people in the San Diego area from Hiroshima?" And they would tell me, "It's because where we came from, we were the poor farmers. We didn't have the money. We didn't live in Tokyo. We weren't we were poor farmers." And so I said, that's why they would send the sons to the United States. Both grandfathers came to the United States 3 times. Both of them at about age 17 to work in the western states in farming, mining, logging. That's what they, did. And then on the 3rd trip back, they got married and essentially came back. But they were farmers, and that's how they started in this country. They came from Japan to Hawaii, to Angel Island, to Sacramento, and that's the mother's side of the family, and farmed Bacon Island in the Delta before the war. They were poor, but grandmother would always say, but we'll always have something to eat. Grandmother, on my mom's side, as I was living with her, I was then like about 4 years old to 9, was much more the grandmother that made sure that I got to school. She didn't drive and she didn't speak English, and she was not yet a citizen until, they never became citizens. The other family became citizens in 1955. But my mother's grandmother was the one that made sure I got to school. She was the one that made sure I went to church. She was, she was the one that was literally running the farm. She was the brains behind the operation. She knew the financial part of it. And so she was she'd get us all going, and she'd make sure everybody go out to the field and so on and so forth. But so she was the one that was sort of the brains behind the operation.
And Grandpa was the muscle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just remember him as he's out in the field all day long, come in and eat, and that was it. But my grandmother was always the one, seems like.
Did she ever teach you about where that came from, that kind of knowledge that she had naturally?
No,
Okay.
no. I just, that kind of tenacity, I think, was passed on to my mother, because she did the same thing.
Oh, okay. Let's move on to your mom now, because you said that you didn't get to see her for the first 10 years of your life. Almost. And what was that reconciliation like afterwards?
I vividly remember the day. My uncle, let me back up. It took until the early 1950s for the antibiotic to treat tuberculosis to be developed. I think it was streptomycin, and then that cured it. That's what they treat it with now, I think. So that would have been the earlier 1950s. She came back and was raised from the second TB sanitarium, or sanatorium, depending on who you ask, in 1954. And I remember my uncle, her brother, said, "Your mom's coming home." And he drove me to the house and dropped me off and left. And there was nobody there. I freaked out. Just a little kid. I was like, where am I? She eventually showed up. And so that was 1954. And we were then living in a one-bedroom guest house that this very wealthy black woman, educated Mrs. Robinson was her name, Beulah Robinson was her name, rented to my father, and it's because no one would rent to him. And so this black lady who was wealthy and educated and was like, wow, unusual, in those days, quite a smart businesswoman. And that house was in Palm City, California, which is about 3 miles from the Mexican border. It's way south in Palm City, and that's what I came home to. I don't know, I'm sort of meandering around here, but should I stop there or no?
You don't have to. You can go in any direction you want. But what was it like getting to know your mom?
Getting to know my mom was, when she came up, I didn't know who she was. I had not seen her. Think about that. So it's like, who are you? It's like, you're telling me what to do. My grandmother tells me what to do. I mean, my grandmother was my mother, basically, right? Yeah. So it's as if they didn't know me. And then it's almost by the time we left Palm City and moved to Chula Vista, which is 6 miles from the border, in 1954, it's almost like my parents are trying to figure out how to raise me. Because by then, I'm hitting the hormones in the teenage, and no kid, it's like, it's different. Understandably now, my sister was born in 1955, 10 years difference. Sharon, my brother Ron was born in 1958. So here's the deal. That's 13 years difference. When I went to college, my brother went to kindergarten. You don't hang out with your brother, When I went to Vietnam, my brother was still in elementary school. So it was as if we didn't know each other. And it's almost like there were two families living in the same household. If you think about that, right? Because for almost the first 10 years of my life, it was my grandparents.
Were they still close by?
My paternal grandparents moved to Los Angeles, East LA, Monterey Park, Boyle Heights. About 6 months after the release from the internment camps, as did my father's whole other side of the family. His sisters and the brother-in-laws, they all moved to either East LA area or Torrance, in that area, right? The maternal side of the family then decided we're going to do a split, and we're going to San Diego. We're going to stay in San Diego. We're going to move south. The reason they did that, for two reasons. First, is my mother knew the minister of the church in San Diego that was a Japanese Christian church that she had met in Modesto prior to the war. And he had been transferred from Modesto to San Diego after the war. And so my mother knew him and that church, and the rest of the family knew other farmers in San Diego that helped them get their farming going. So they formed sort of a co-op. Sure. And so if I knew you, he said, can you loan me $5,000 to get this thing started? And so that was the, because when they left the camps, they had nothing, you know. And others, my friends' families never returned to California. They went to Chicago and, you know, and Utah. They never came back. And that's a whole nother story about, you know, I'm not going back to California, right? You know, so Chicago is where others went. But that's how we ended up in San Diego, is because they knew the minister and they knew people who were farming.
Did your grandparents help you and your parents bond a little bit easier?
I don't have a strong feeling about that.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. I always felt a little bit, if you look at the entire clan on my father's side, I'm the oldest. The youngest was born in 1960. I was born in 1945, so I was the oldest of them all. And it was almost like my mom used to say to me, you act like our generation. You act like the older, not surprising. I grew up around grandparents, right? So there's quite an age difference in that, but grandparents didn't have an active role in the parenting part of it, you know, from what I can recall.
Mm-hmm. You said that growing up, and once your brother and sister came into the picture, it almost felt like there was two families in the same house.
Yes.
Did that ever change over time?
No.
No. Yeah.
No, never changed over time. Because this, you know, like I said, I mean, my brother was still in elementary school and I was going off to college, and then I was gone. I was gone, right? And then, you know, I went to my undergraduate program. Then I, you know, went to Vietnam in the Army, and then I came back and worked and went back to graduate school, and then I moved up north and I never went back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's almost as if it's almost as if that part of the family is on paper, because we didn't grow up together. Mm-hmm. You know.
So you said you did your undergrad work. Were you drafted into the Vietnam War?
I was.
Interesting. So did you draft him, since you had a degree? Were you given an officer's rating, or were you enlisted?
in 1965, I got my first draft notice when I was going to Southwestern Community College. And I got out of it. But at that time, I honest to God didn't know where Vietnam was. I had to look it up on a map in 65. Go, where is this place? So then I transferred to San Diego State University and was majoring in health sciences. And I thought, I'll just stay in school forever because the war's going to be over. It wasn't, and it didn't end, and it went on and on and on. So I graduated with my undergraduate degree in May of '69, and in June of '69 I got a draft notice, and in July of '69 I was at Fort Ord, and by December of '69 I was in Vietnam. In order for me to be an officer, and there were many college graduates that were drafted during what we call the June-July draft, because we were just replacements. And so I didn't want to go to an officer candidate school and, like my brother-in-law, spend 6 years in there. You know, my brother-in-law went to dental school and then had to pay back 6 years. So I did what everybody else did and went to Fort Ord, and we got assigned what was called our MOS, Military Occupational Specialists, and the code that nobody wanted was called 11B, which was Light Weapons Infantry. And guess what we got? All of us got that code and that specialty. When we were going through our physical, I remember being told by a sergeant, "You guys are all going to Vietnam." He was right. He was right. So I did my advanced infantry training at Fort Ord. Got assignment for Republic of Vietnam, and was signed to the 101st Airborne Division. That's the Band of Brothers group.
Yeah. Wow.
So I was part of the infantry air assault unit, and spent 14 months there, which was enough for me. But I was way up. Vietnam is shaped like California, and it is broken into 4 regions, 1, 2, 3, 4, I Corps. And I was way up by the demilitarized zone and the border of Laos, which was the main route for everything to come in. And to this day, I'm still part of 2 or 3 of us that gets our group together. And then we just got together about a month ago. Sort of a Band of Brothers kind of a thing at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So that's the war story. Not anything that I wanted to do, but I think there was also part of this that my uncle James, my mother's brother, and the younger brother, who both served in the Army during World War II, right? Both would pound into me, "You must serve this country." Okay? I mean, I'm not the only guy that was ever told to, but, you know, you have to, don't try to get out of it, you know, serve. And so there was this it was always there. Yeah, so.
I would like to actually get back to how you and I originally met. I want to ask you how you learned about the Orangevale History Museum.
I was reading the Orangevale View, the paper, and I went, "Wow, that's interesting." I mean, that's like, I live a mile from here.
Yeah.
You know, I've driven by here forever, right? But there was a story about, or there was a presentation that was going to go on about the first Japanese family in Orangevale. And I went, "Really? That's interesting." So I think I found it on YouTube or something or other. And I went, "Wow, that's interesting. I think I'm going to drive over to the museum tomorrow." And I did, and Mark was here, right? And I talked to him for about an hour, and then here I am.
Well, what made you want to drive all the way over here? Because I think the first time we met, you said, you watched it the night of our presentation. I don't know if you watched it live, but you told me you'd watched it twice before you drove over to the museum the next morning. And I just wanted to know, what about their story resonated with you and made you want to drive over here?
What resonated with me was it's almost exactly the same story as my family, and they came from, I think, Hiroshima, and they also were in the same internment camp in Poston, Arizona. And what resonated with me was that they were growers in here, I guess, and were trying to start a vineyard or something, and it was similar to my story, because even though I grew up in San Diego, in my high school graduating class, we were the largest minority group, and there was only 12 Japanese kids. There was a couple Mexican kids and 2 black kids, but that was it then, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. And and then I read about where they eventually ended up, and they went to college and so on and so forth. And I went, well, they moved to the, I think, San Dimas area or something, they said. And I said, I know where that is, because I used to live in San Fernando Valley, when I went to graduate school. And it was striking to me, the similarity of the story. I'm sure there's other stories like that, but to me, it's so local. That's what made it different. It's so local. There's stories out there, but when the story is a mile away from you, and what struck me is like, so I've been living here 40 years, I didn't know that, but that's what got me into it. The other thing that got me into it was, of late, in the last year or so, I've really been doing a lot of research about the internment. And my niece, my sister's daughter in San Francisco, as late as this past summer, has ventured to Amache, Colorado, that internment camp where my mother was, family, and is working with, or has worked with, the University of Colorado anthropology PhD students and the U.S. Park Service anthropologists, and they're doing digs of that camp as late as last June. And so she spent a week there, and she's, I think, going back this next year. But when she was there this year in June, she said, I found the location of Mom's barrack, the foundation. She goes, I know exactly what room she was in and what building she was in. She says, we found groups of arrowheads by the camp remains, and she said she had to ask the anthropologist, the National Park anthropologist, where are these arrowheads coming from? The Japanese didn't make these. He said, no, the children would go play by the Arkansas River, which is where the natives would hunt. And she found remnants of where the women had a sewing center. And so they were all lined up, and scanning. And so I talked to her a couple of days ago, and her interest is really big now. I think because she's had a baby, she's married. And I asked Stephanie, why now? She goes, Grandma had a big influence on me, my mom. I said, really? Now, mind you, she was born in 1985, so I never really grew up around her, right? I said, such as what? And she said, these are the lessons that are coming back. I said, no, you're a new mom now. Stuff is coming back. As we have young children, and as we lose elders, I think stuff comes back. I think. For me, it does.
That's my experience too.
Yeah, it's just like, where did that come from? It's not anything that I consciously say, let me think about and work on this. It'll just be like, popped up. So, is that kind of it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the time after your service and how you ended up in Orangevale, if you wanted just to touch on that a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. I got back from Vietnam March 1st of 1971. Left Vietnam, went through Cam Ranh Bay, Yokota, Japan, Anchorage, Alaska. Left the Army from Fort Lewis, Washington. Came back, didn't have a job. Was wondering what my life was going to be like. But I eventually got a job with the San Diego Public Health Department in the field that I studied, public health and the medical field. Fortunately for me, one of my professors, Dr. Dick Grant at San Diego State, at that time became the assistant director for the Department of Health and hired me. And I spent about 3.5 years there working in the early phases of what we call substance abuse issues. There was lots of drugs in those days. And among the things I was responsible for was what we called a drug diversion program in San Diego County under Governor Dudumagian, I think, which were, at that point, people were saying, can't incarcerate everybody that comes through here. Maybe we should try to do classes and mandate, especially if it's not the hardcore, they're not dealing, they're just possessing. So at one point, Dr. Grant said, you need to get out of here and go to graduate school. You're wasting your time here now. And I said, I really don't want to. But I did. And I went to graduate school at Cal State Northridge in public health. And loved the school, didn't like the area, Los Angeles. In about 1980, then I got a job in Monterey County, and it was a joint kind of research project with Stanford University and the health department there, and it was a heart disease prevention research trial. And so what was interesting to me, was I was in Monterey. That was the very place where I went through basic training. I'm back here. But then that job sort of ran out, and I thought, so where do I go now? I had 2 job offers. One was at San Jose Hospital, and the other I had connected with a friend that I had met at a conference out of Yolo County. And he said, there's a job opening as a director of health education for Kaiser Sacramento region. I said, really? I said, I don't want to live in San Jose. I really don't. And so I got the job in 1985 at Kaiser. And I was in charge of the health education department for the region. But I didn't have anywhere to stay. So I talked to one of the women I worked with, and she said, my sister lives in this place called Orangevale on Beach Avenue. Can you talk to her and see if I can stay there for about a month? I don't even have an apartment, And she said, sure, I'll talk to her. Over there, right? Yep. Throw a rock that far. And that's how I ended up in Orangevale. And I started driving around, especially this area over here, and I went, I like this. It reminded me of home. The orchard and, this part over here, but it's a stroke of luck. I just happened to be staying on Beach Avenue, and they're still there, but, and that's literally how I ended up here.
And you ended up staying.
Yeah, and I ended up staying ever since, and after Kaiser, I left Kaiser and then eventually went back into the public health field and ended up retiring from Placer County Health Department in public health, which was most of my career was in that. But that's the Orangevale connection. I'll tell people Orangevale, and they go, where's that? I'll say, where Folsom is? Yeah.
That's what I love about it, because people who find their way to Orangevale I like to say they've broken the code because Orangevale, I believe, is underrated.
I do too.
And some people like to keep it that way.
To me is, it's just this center that's between this and that, between Folsom and Fair Oaks and Roseville, right? Not Roseville, but here it is, right here, right? And I tell people, down south, I was just down in San Diego, and I said, well, Orangevale, where is it? I said, you know where Folsom is? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, our team played the Folsom High School Bowl. Yeah, okay, well, we're right next to it.
Well, George, before we wrap things up, is there anything you want to ask Alan?
In your time that you've lived in Orangevale, are there any memories that particularly stand out to you? You know, watching it's not a city, but watching the area grow. Have you seen changes?
In the area, the most significant of which is, although it's in Citrus Heights, is the Sunrise Shopping Center.
Right.
It's like, what happened? What happened? That's changed, and I think the Folsom side has changed, that part of it,
Right.
and then the Roseville side has changed. Feels like it's changed, but Orangevale still sort, in me, maintains this kind of identity, I guess, Although I gotta say, Greenback is getting kind of busy.
Yes.
Yeah. You're so right about that.
Yeah, but I do like the fact that Orangevale is trying to maintain some of its identity, and you've got this going on, and Orangevale Live going on, and
Right.
you've got the Grange going on, and that's stuff that I didn't take advantage of earlier,
Right.
You can take classes or do whatever you want,
Right.
but I like Orangevale. It has a nice feel to me.
Well, unless there's any more information or a last minute story you wanted to share, I just wanted to let you know that I've had an amazing time listening to your stories, Alan, and I really appreciate you coming here and
Sure.
telling them. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.